So when we're managing the funds in our school-generated accounts, it's always important that we go back to board procedures and make sure that we are following the business practices that are prescribed by the board. Principals and vice principals need to always be mindful that following these processes will help them, because if they're following the procedure, they are following good banking or good business practices. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. I think the other things to remember is that that responsibility of overseeing the school accounts is one that should be taken seriously. Principals should be scrutinizing transactions. They should be looking at account balances. They should be mindful of going through that account on a monthly basis, understanding how money has been deposited, spent, making sure that the corresponding receipts, the paperwork is all in order. That's not something that should just be delegated. Yes, there should be other staff doing those particular jobs, but the principal has a responsibility to make sure they're overseeing those processes.
The ultimate responsibility for the school-generated funds lies with the principal. The principal needs to be aware of the processes that the board expects to be used and the processes that the school is actually using, and that make sure that they align. Where they fall into difficulty is where they come into a school, processes have been in place, and they're just prepared to let those processes continue without checking to see if they align with board policies. And those are the situations where we find difficulty for principals and vice principals, because they assume that there are certain things occurring, and sometimes they're not occurring correctly and within the law.
When we're talking about school principals supervising the school-generated funds, it's important that they engage the staff in meaningful conversations around the budget and around how money gets spent within the school, that the procedures and protocols are communicated clearly to the teachers and the other support staff. The same is true in discussions with parents, that reports back of how money gets spent of school-generated funds, really important in terms of communication with the community and in promoting a sense of transparency and accountability to the school community.
The school administrator plays an important role in managing the flow of funds into and out of a school. The school administrator should take time with staff to ensure that they understand the policies and procedures in place to govern the collection, distribution, and safeguarding of cash in a school.
Principals need to be supervising the staff that are directly involved with the collection of money, showing an interest in that, being aware of the deposit slips that get filled out, having a discussion with the office staff around the transactions, the process for banking the money, that type of thing, so that it's really clear that they're playing that supervisory role as they work through the process of managing the school accounts.
The policies and procedures governing school-generated funds have been put into place to help protect and safeguard the funds that are collected, to ensure that the funds collected are used for their intended purpose to benefit students. It's also important that we recognize the policies and procedures are in place to protect administrators and staff, to ensure that there's an appropriate structure in place such that schools are accountable and transparent with the collection, safeguarding, and disbursement of financial resources within their schools.
Principals should ensure that those individuals who are actually collecting cash or checks, but generally cash, are adhering to the board policies with respect to that. How many people are counting, how the deposit is made, where is the money deposited to. However, if a principal suspects that there's some irregularities with respect to that, they need to report that immediately and investigate that immediately.
If a principal suspects that the processes and procedures are not being followed correctly with respect to the school-generated funds or other budget money within the school, I think it's really important that they bring that to the staff members' attention quickly and directly, and in a supportive way, in helping to ensure that the staff member understands what the processes are, to evaluate whether more training needs to take place or more communication. Perhaps those procedures aren't clearly understood by the teachers or the office staff, and in that case the principal would be performing their supervisory duties of overseeing that and correcting and discussing the matter further with the staff member.
When an administrator becomes aware of a staff member that is not abiding by the policies and procedures set forward by the board, it would be appropriate for that administrator to provide some additional opportunities to make the staff member aware of the policies and procedures, but to also connect with their family of school superintendent to discuss the situation and determine appropriate next steps.
If it's a fairly minor matter where perhaps the envelope of money did not go down to the office in the correct way and it's something that can be corrected right on the spot, that's one thing. But if there is a repeated pattern or there's something more serious where there's money missing, it is important to report those things to the superintendent who's responsible for your school. They can be a support, they can help the principal problem solve around how to monitor the situation better, what other training could be put in place, whatever corrective action needs to happen. So keeping your superintendent involved is a good idea.
If it's large sums of money, they also need to work with their supervisory officers and perhaps report that to the police. But if there are discrepancies of $1 or so, you'd go back to the individuals who did the counting and ask them to verify again the money that's been counted.
There are circumstances in which those responsible for the managing of cash in a school are absent. This could be an unforeseen or a planned absence. In those circumstances, it's appropriate to have backup individuals that will be able to support the adherence to the policies and procedures set forward by the board.
School-generated funds, those accounts should be managed by at least 2, if not 3 people. So for instance, with respect to the signing of checks, the payment of checks, you would have 2 signatories required on those checks with a 3rd backup. Many schools do not have a 3rd person available. There's no vice principal, there's no 2nd secretary. So you would have the principal and the secretary as the main signatories. However, to address the issue of one of those 2 individuals being on leave, school boards have asked that a neighboring principal perhaps be a 3rd signatory, or the supervisory officer, to ensure that there is never a time that you don't have 2 people responsible for the accounting and for the school-generated funds in general.
When we're talking about the school-generated fund account, I think it's always important that we remember that when we're generating money, we need to have a plan in mind of how that money is going to be spent. And there are projects that take more than 1 year to achieve the goal of buying new playground equipment, for example, or new IT equipment. So it's important that, again, principals go back to their business procedures that are within the board and have an understanding of how they are allowed to invest those monies, if that's what's going to happen in this case, if it's a fund that's going to take some time to generate the money for a particular goal.
School-generated funds are collected for the purposes of students and student use, because the vast majority of that money comes from students and their families. Those funds should be expended by board policy in the year that they've been collected or for the subsequent year. So principals are required to develop a plan with their school council on school-generated funds, how those funds are going to be expended, and they have to report on that.
It's really important that we're mindful of what the procurement guidelines are. And that's a fairly new concept for principals within the last 5 to 10 years. And it really springs from this idea that we're spending public money, and it's really important that there's an accountability perspective as far as the public goes, that we're getting the best price, that we're making sure that the funds are being spent in a wise way.
It's important that administrators are aware of the broader public sector procurement guidelines, and they're aware of the board's policies and procedures that govern procurement. In these instances, contacting the procurement department will help you identify vendors of record, beneficial pricing. A great example of this is the procurement of mobile technology. Procuring mobile technology at a local store may not yield the best price, and it may not be purchased on plan, which means that the device may not be under warranty and protected as other devices within the board Furthermore, by procuring centrally through the use of procurement services, administrators will be able to ensure that the devices are tracked properly, supported properly, and have the appropriate software available on them to support their intended purposes for student learning and achievement.
If there is money left over that things didn't cost quite as much as they thought they should, then they should also plan on meeting with staff, with parent representatives within their school community, and reporting back, how that money was spent and how much money is left over. And then what is the new plan now? What are the priorities within the school that we're going to spend money on in our school community for the benefit of our students? And look at how that lines up with the school priorities as well as the board priorities.
I would strongly advise that principals know what the board policy is, know what the procedures are, share those procedures and policies with their staff, review them on an annual basis, and ensure that he or she is working closely with the school secretary to make sure there's consistent administration and implementation of those policies and procedures at the school level. Ultimately, the principal is responsible.
My advice to principals when it comes to managing the budget and dealing with school-generated funds is always focus back on what these funds were actually intended to do. So we collect money for a reason. We collect it to support student achievement and well-being, to support the students within our school community, and absolutely the intention should be that the money is spent for that purpose. At the same time, we need to make sure that it's aligned with the priorities within the board and within the school itself, and that we are able to account for how the money's spent, and that we are communicating clearly with our school community as to how that takes place. So that's a key piece in all of this, is that principals need to be accountable for the funds within their school, and they need to be transparent in the way that they're managing those funds.
As a final piece of advice for administrators dealing with school-generated funds, it's important that you understand the policies and procedures governing school-generated funds. And if you do have any questions, it's always important that you call before you dig. Connect with your superintendent, connect with financial services to ensure that you understand the policies and procedures and the actions and your roles and responsibilities as it relates to school-generated funds.